Well, welcome once again to Bible Talk with Bruce and Becky. It's Christmas week, and we wish you and all of your loved ones a very, very Merry Christmas. Now let's get into Genesis again. We're moving rapidly toward a conclusion.
So
Well,
what has Genesis got to do with Christmas?
uh,
I get to ask you questions this time.
I'm supposed to answer that. Well, the whole Bible is about the coming of the Savior, and Genesis gets us started on that journey, but it doesn't have anything directly to do with Christmas unless you think of something.
Um, it's the history of his ancestors for sure.
Okay.
All of his kinfolk from way back.
And promises about his coming to bless all the nations of the earth.
And I would contend that a book with 66 books written over a period of over 1,500 years with how many authors approximately?
40.
Approximately 40 authors. I would say that that is not a conspiracy, could not be a conspiracy. And anybody who thinks that this was all made up to prove that Jesus is the Son of God has got to use a little more brain power and figure out that that just is not so. It's the truth. And they should explore it and find out.
So Becky starts us off with that nice sermonette.
Merry Christmas.
Joy to the world, the Lord is come.
Enough. Okay.
Okay. Now we're getting into Genesis chapter 45. We'll begin at verse 21. Last time we saw that Pharaoh had not only given Joseph permission to bring his family to Egypt, but gave them some of the best of the land in the land of Goshen, and gave them wagons and chariots to bring the family down there. So we'll begin at that point in verse 21. Becky, if you will kindly read 21 through 28, the end of the chapter, please.
Okay. I do want to mention, he said, don't worry about bringing anything. He says, because you can have anything in Egypt when you get here.
Well, did you think that they wouldn't bring stuff?
Well, I'm sure they did.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
But
I thought that was really. And of course, when they left Egypt, they took a lot of stuff with them
that's
that
right.
people said, here, take this, get out of here, kind of thing.
They spoiled the Egyptians. You can read about that in the book of Exodus.
Okay, verse 21. How far?
To the end of the chapter.
So the sons of Israel did this. Joseph gave them carts as Pharaoh had commanded, and he also gave them provisions for their journey. To each of them he gave new clothing. But to Benjamin he gave 300 shekels of silver and 5 sets of clothes. And this is what he sent to his father: 10 donkeys loaded with the best things of Egypt, and 10 female donkeys loaded with grain and bread and other provisions for his journey. Then he sent his brothers away, and as they were leaving, he said to them, don't quarrel on the way. So they went up out of Egypt and came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan. They told him, Joseph is still alive. In fact, he is ruler of all Egypt. Jacob was stunned. He did not believe them. But when they told him everything Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the carts Joseph had sent to carry them back, the spirit of their father Jacob revived, and Israel said, I'm convinced. My son Joseph is still alive, and I will go and see him before I die.
Well, we can hardly imagine, I'm sure, just how stunned Jacob was with the news that his son Joseph was alive. In fact, this translation, the ESV, a little more literal, says his heart became numb. He was in shock for a while, but he recovers. He said, let's do it. Let's move to Egypt, and I'll see my son before I die, little knowing that he had 17 more years to live. But that brings us to a turning point in the story of Abraham's descendants, in the story of the promises made to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob himself about the blessing that would come through Jacob's descendants. And of course, his family must stay alive in order to pass on those blessings. Anything that occurs to you, Becky, before we move into the next chapter?
Well, I think he probably had to see it to believe it. I mean, he believes it, but he wants to go see for sure that Joseph is alive.
Yeah, he wants to see Joseph himself
Yeah.
after all these years of missing him. It's been 13 years or so since Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers. And I always chuckle when I read chapter 45, verse 24. Joseph sent his brothers away, and as they departed, he said to them, "Do not quarrel on the way." He knows these brothers well enough. There's plenty that they could quarrel about, but he just wants them to get up there and bring his dad and the rest of the family down. Well, verse 46, or
Chapter
chapter
46.
46, verse 1. So Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, "Jacob, Jacob." And he said, "Here am I." Then he said, "I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again. Joseph's hand shall close your eyes." That would be closing his eyes in death, of course. And even, or especially at this early date in the Israelites dealing with God, it would come as somewhat a surprise that God would be with them going to Egypt and coming back up. I don't know about Jacob or his direct descendants, but some of those people would have thought that each God had his own territory and his own nation that he favored. And even as late as the Babylonian captivity, the Israelites would still wonder if God would be there in Babylon when they got that far away. But as we know from more revelation that they didn't have yet, God is everywhere, and he will go with them to Egypt, and he will make sure they get back again to the land he promised to Abraham. Verse 5, before we move on, you have any other comment, question?
Well, it's comforting to know that he's going to see his son before he dies.
All right. God speaks directly to, well, indirectly, I guess, to Jacob in a vision. We tend to think sometimes that in the Bible times, God spoke to people all the time, but this is only, well, I didn't go back and confirm, but this is only the second or third time in Jacob's lifetime that God had spoken to him, and that was a long life. So it's an important occasion. God wants to confirm that the promises will be kept. Well, verse 5. So Jacob set out from Beersheba. The sons of Israel carried Jacob their father, their little ones and their wives, in the wagons that Pharaoh had sent to carry him. They also took their livestock and their goods, which they had gained in the land of Canaan, and came into Egypt, Jacob and all his offspring with him, his sons and his sons' sons with him, his daughters and his sons' daughters. All his offspring he brought with him into Egypt. Well, the next part of this chapter, from verse 8 through verse uh, 23, lists all of Jacob's direct descendants according to the two wives and the two concubines he had, and how many descendants of each of his sons went into Egypt. So our homework for next time is memorize all of these names, identify which ones go with which wives, and which of the sons of Israel, and that will be on the exam. Nah, I'm only joking. I couldn't do that if I had to at this point in my life.
You can't list them alphabetically by height?
Maybe alphabetically by height, but I couldn't remember who each one's mother was.
Okay.
That's an old family joke that I make every time we line up for a group picture, alphabetically by height, please. Well, the whole family, all of Jacob's offspring, all of the sons of Israel and his daughters uh, go into Egypt together. I will have a pop quiz, however, before we finish the chapter, as to the total number who go into Egypt. And the answer may be a little tricky. But first, Becky will read, beginning with verse 26, once again to the end of chapter 46, verse 34.
Okay. All those who went to Egypt with Jacob, those who were his direct descendants, not counting his sons' wives, numbered 66 persons. With the 2 sons who had been born to Joseph in Egypt, that the members of Jacob's family which went to Egypt were 70 in all. Now Jacob sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to get directions to Goshen. When they arrived in the region of Goshen, Joseph had his chariot made ready and went to Goshen to meet his father Israel. As soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around his father and wept for a long time. Israel said to Joseph, "Now I am ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive." Then Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, "I will go up and speak to Pharaoh and will say to him, 'My brothers and my father's household, who are living in the land of Canaan, have come to me. The men are shepherds, they tend livestock, and they have brought along their flocks and herds and everything they own. When Pharaoh calls you in and asks, what is your occupation, you should answer, your servants have tended livestock from our boyhood on, just as our fathers did. Then you will be allowed to settle in the region of Goshen, for all shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians.'"
All right, a cheerful reunion between father and son. This, once again, a more literal translation says in verse 28 that Joseph fell on his father's neck and wept on his neck a good while. It's kind of a Hebrew idiom for embracing and weeping. Jacob then is ready to die, he says. Everything he wanted now, he has. All of his family together, including Joseph. A bit of a puzzle in verse 34 that every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. But it seems to explain why they're given the land of Goshen. They would be separate from the body of Egyptian natives and able to tend their flocks and herds there. All right, I promised a pop quiz with perhaps a tricky answer. How many of Israel's descendants went down into Egypt?
It says 66, not counting the wives.
Yeah, and then in the next verse, all the persons of the house of Jacob who came into Egypt were 70.
That's counting Joseph and his 2 sons.
2 sons, and maybe his wife.
That's what I'm wondering.
Do you remember the names of the 2 sons?
Ephraim and Manasseh.
Good job. Ephraim and Manasseh, who later are included at times in the list of the 12 tribes. However, here's what's tricky about it, and I checked this again before we started tonight. In the book of Acts in the New Testament, a man named Stephen, one of 7 deacons chosen by the early church, makes a long speech in Jerusalem. The speech's theme is pretty much the unfaithfulness of Israel from the beginning, and the reason that the temple in Jerusalem will be destroyed by the Romans. In Acts chapter 7, I believe about verse 41, Stephen is rehearsing the history of the Israelites, and he talks about Jacob and his descendants going into Egypt. And what does it say? Do you have verse 41, Becky? Acts 7.
It is. It's hard to read these little bitty numbers. 39, 40, 41. That was the time they made an idol in the form of a calf. They brought sacrifices to it.
No, that's
Nope.
not it.
God turned away.
It's
Blah, 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 blah.
earlier.
Must be.
Pardon the delay here, but my memory, it just ain't what it used to be. Let me see that and I'll find it.
Okay. Number of our people in Egypt.
It's verse 14. I just had it reversed.
Okay.
After this, Joseph sent for his father Jacob and his whole family, 75 in all, says Stephen. Okay. Genesis says 70, including apparently Joseph's two sons, Joseph himself and his wife. But Stephen, using an old Jewish Hebrew tradition, Jewish tradition, says 75 went down.
Maybe some of them wives were pregnant.
Well, you can't count pregnant wives and fetuses and, well,
Those are Israelites, and
I
they're
know.
going down into Egypt.
Not a bad supposition. I have the answer.
Oh.
I could sum it up in 3 words. Maybe 2 words. I could say I don't know, and I could also say nobody knows. There are various explanations proposed, and I'm not going to get into all of that. If you were really, really skeptical about the Bible, you could say, see, you can't trust it. One place says 70, another says 75. Well, there are explanations. Let's say approximately 70 people went into Egypt, and they come out a great nation. That's the point of the story. And if you want to look it up, I may even do some research before next time if I remember, and give you possible explanations. Give me a call, send me a text, drop me an email if you want an explanation next time.
But you can get into heaven without knowing, right?
I don't think this is on the big final exam in the sky. Hope not. I couldn't even remember what verse to look for in Acts.
Is it multiple choice?
I think it's true false.
That would make sense.
Yeah. Enough of this frivolity while we get back to our text. Okay, we've got them all down in Egypt in the land of Goshen, where they can keep their flocks. Had a happy reunion between Joseph and his father. Now we're going to settle them in a bit and let Jacob's family meet Pharaoh, at least the ones that haven't met him yet, in chapter 47 of Genesis. I'll read the first 6 verses, and Becky can read 7 through 12, and we'll stop there for today. Chapter 47 of Genesis. Joseph went in and told Pharaoh, my father and my brothers, with their flocks and herds and all that they possess, have come from the land of Canaan. They are now in the land of Goshen. And from among his brothers he took 5 men and presented them to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to his brothers, what is your occupation? And they said to Pharaoh, your servants are shepherds, as our fathers were. They said to Pharaoh, we have come to sojourn in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen. Pharaoh said to Joseph, your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and brothers in the best of the land, Let them settle in the land of Goshen. And if you know any able men among them, put them in charge of my livestock. So this Pharaoh is very Genesis. Genesis. He is generous in Genesis because of Joseph's faithful service in rescuing them from the famine, as well as all of that land around about. The land of Goshen, by the way, is in the Nile Delta.
Very fertile.
Very fertile country. Removed somewhat from the capital city of Egypt at this time. And the Egyptians, the different pharaohs, had several different capitals, but it was not in the Delta at this point in their history. So Pharaoh says, not only can you settle your flocks and herds, but put some of your brothers in charge of my livestock. And Joseph is in charge of feeding all the people. Well, I'm through talking about that section, trying to keep it straight. Anything you want to say before we read the last of today's?
Nope.
Please read then, chapter 47, 7 through 12.
Then Joseph brought his father Jacob in and presented him before Pharaoh. After Jacob blessed Pharaoh, Pharaoh asked him, "How old are you?" Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers." Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. So Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt and gave them property in the best part of the land, the district of Ramses, as Pharaoh directed. Joseph also provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food according to the numbers of their children.
Okay. Pharaoh has an interview with Jacob, and he literally asks him in verse 8, "How many are the days of the years of your life?" Again, an idiomatic expression that's found in other places in Genesis. "Oh, the days of the years of my sojourn are few and difficult. Can't compare with my father's." A typical way of speaking, you'll find this kind of humility, whether true or false humility. For example, when they're bargaining with someone, this product that I have to offer is pitiful. I couldn't ask more than so and so for it. And then they will allow themselves to be bargained down to a lower price. It's just a typical Middle Eastern at this time and Egyptian way of talking about yourself. Actually, Jacob is going to live nearly as long as Abraham, but not nearly as important as Abraham, he would say. But verse 10 should have caught our attention because of what seems to be an unusual occurrence.
Yeah.
Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Usually, in a situation like that, the person of higher status would bless the one of lower status. In the eyes of the world, Pharaoh should be blessing Jacob. But Jacob pronounces a blessing on Pharaoh. At least in the eyes of the Bible, Jacob is a more significant person. Even to the point that the Pharaoh's name is not given. None of the pharaohs in Genesis are named. In fact, I believe I'm correct that only one pharaoh mentioned in the Old Testament is given his name, and that's much later in the books of Chronicles.
When it mentions the land of Ramses.
Ah, I'm glad you noticed that. What about it?
Well, you tell me. So Ramses is long dead, I assume.
No, he hadn't been born yet.
Oh.
This is an anachronism.
Oh. Okay.
Ramses would not have been known by his name in the time of Jacob and Joseph. However, assuming Moses is writing this, Ramses would have been well known to the people that Moses first told this story to. In fact, he may be, there was more than one Ramses, but Ramses the Great, who had his statues and his name all over the land of Egypt in his time, may have been the Pharaoh of the Exodus. I think that's what Cecil B. DeMille indicated in the Ten Commandments.
Well, he must have got it right.
Well, if Cecil B. DeMille said that, that's good enough for me. Yes, Becky was alert to that Ramses was not known at this time, but later on this land was called the land of Ramses. In fact, it's in the same area that the Israelites built two store cities for the Pharaoh. In the book of Exodus, they were known as Pithom and Ramses. So the name that was later given to this land, some 4 generations later, is used here by the writer. Okay, well, we've got all the Israelites in Egypt, but in our study, at least for the near future, we're not going to get them back out. I think we can all know that they got out of Egypt in the book of Exodus. Or if you don't want to read Exodus, rent the Ten Commandments or look it up on Netflix or wherever it is and watch it again. I'm through talking now. The main point we can get from this reading tonight and the story of Genesis is God is remaining in charge and He's directing things according to His purpose, even when it doesn't look like it. And there have been many times already in the book of Genesis when it doesn't look like it, but we find out that He's in charge. Joseph will remind us of that soon. All right, that's all I'm going to say for now. Anything you want to add, Becky?
Merry Christmas.
Again, Merry Christmas to everybody, and to all a good night. God bless us, everyone. And don't send money